Today's episode of the Cloudcast is sponsored by Datadog. Bring speed and scale to your security organization. Datadog Cloud Security Platform delivers real-time threat detection and continuous configuration audits across applications, hosts, containers, and cloud infrastructure. Built on top of the observability platform, Datadog brings unprecedented integration between security and DevOps aligned to shared organizational goals. As a listener to the Cloudcast, you can sign up for a free 2-week trial to see for yourself how Datadog can elevate your cloud infrastructure security posture by visiting datadog.com/security-cloudcast. Sign up now and receive a free Datadog t-shirt. That's datadog.com/security-cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And it is almost the end of January, and that means also the last of our look-ahead shows. I can't believe we are 1 month into 2022 already. But it has been amazing. I hope everyone is staying safe, staying warm, staying healthy. And with that, we're going to dig into Cloud News of the Week. It is, just like last week, it's a bit of a slow news week, but we do have some interesting quarterly results that we're going to talk about, as well as potentially one big kind of rumors and speculation. So let's jump into that one. NVIDIA. Reportedly, allegedly, however we want to call this is all rumors, but NVIDIA reportedly moving to scrap the $40 billion ARM acquisition. So anybody who's followed this, this has been drawn out for, well over a year now at this point, but seen as an extremely large acquisition when first announced, but also a lot of folks didn't like it. A lot of governments didn't like it. I know China didn't approve of it. The UK didn't approve of it. Here in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC, they objected to it. Some big companies have objected to it. And why? Well, when it comes right down to it, most of NVIDIA's competition runs on ARM. And so this was just seen as a bit of an overreach, a bit of a monopoly, locking up too much of the market. And so this is something that may end up falling apart. If so, what happens? ARM is still owned by SoftBank, and probably if this falls apart, SoftBank then takes ARM and goes IPO. I think that's probably really the only thing left for them at this point, so that SoftBank can get a cash out in the end of all of this. So again, all of that is alleged and reportedly, but we will keep following that more closely. As I mentioned earlier in the news, we've got some revenues and some quarterly reports that started coming in here. First of all, Microsoft. Microsoft had a fantastic quarter, $51.7 billion in Q2, which, by the way, first quarter of 50 plus billion, and that was expected. And within the cloud group, 22.1 billion. So that's up 32%, if I remember correctly. And it was only their second time doing a quarter of over 20 billion. So Microsoft is chugging right along. And certainly one of the big reasons they're seeing that growth is Azure subscriptions. They're starting to see both larger subscriptions as well as for longer periods of time. So really starting to lock in that recurring revenue as well. And lastly, another one that reported was IBM. IBM saw a very strong quarter, about $6 billion. I'm trying to find the exact number right here, $6.2 billion for the quarter in cloud revenue. So a really nice jump for them. And we have gotten feedback in the past that we do tend to skew heavily towards the big three, if you will, GCP, Azure, and AWS. We wanted to report on IBM and their cloud as well. And this is good to see because at one point, It really was just, hey, it's the big three, and then, have some of the larger ones worldwide like Alibaba and some of the others. But what about some of these other companies as they do their transition as well? So even though IBM was maybe a little bit later to the game, they of course have very large on-prem premise, and the on-premises play for them, and all about hybrid cloud as well. So what we're seeing here is that hybrid cloud adoption start to take hold within their accounts. So with that, I'm going to wrap up Cloud News of the Week right after the break. As I mentioned, the last of our look-ahead shows, we're going to be talking to Dave Vellante over at SiliconAngle and co-host of theCUBE as well, and talking about SuperClouds and some of the trends we're seeing there with application services. And that is coming up right after the break.
Today's show is sponsored by Mergify. Mergify is a tool for GitHub that prioritizes queues and automatically merges, comments, rebases, updates, labels, backports, closes, and assigns your pull requests. Mergify features allow you to automate what you would normally do manually. You can secure your code using a merge queue, automatically merge it, and many more features. By saving time, you and your team can focus on projects that matter. Mergify is coordinated with any CI and fully integrated into GitHub. Check out their startup program that could give your company a 12-month credit to leverage Mergify up to a $21,000 value. Start saving time. Visit Mergify.com to sign up for a demo and get started today. That's Mergify.com. Today's show is sponsored by CloudZero. For software-driven companies focused on growing margins, CloudZero is the only cloud cost intelligence platform that puts engineering in control by connecting technical decisions to business results. By analyzing cloud services like AWS and Snowflake, CloudZero provides real-time cost insights that help you maximize margins. Engineering teams can answer critical questions like, who are my most expensive customers? How much does this specific feature cost our business? What's the cost impact of re-architecting this application? With cost anomaly alerts via Slack, product-specific data views, and granular engineering context that makes it easy to investigate any cost, CloudZero is your complete cloud cost intelligence platform, connecting the dots between high-level trends and individual line items. Join companies like Drift, Rapid7, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started today. That's cloudzero.com/cloudcast. And we're back. And, folks, one of the topics that Aaron and I had brought up, in our 2021 wrap-up show was sort of this idea, and we didn't really have a name for it at the time, but it was sort of this idea that we're seeing this evolution of not only, how the public clouds are being used. We've gone through a decade now of people figuring out, what are they? How do we use them? We've seen a number of native companies be built on them. And then we begin to see sort of existing companies of all industries sort of begin to move their applications onto there. But we felt like we were really seeing this sort of trend happen in which, sort of a next generation of types of applications were being built on top of the public cloud. They had sort of newer types of capabilities that, maybe they'd come out of open source, or maybe they were scalable in new ways, or maybe they were extending across multiple clouds. And so we had sort of seen this trend happen, and we couldn't really put our finger on it. What is this thing is? What did it mean? What is it? Where is it going? And then this concept came along that we're really excited about, and we want to kind of dig into it, this concept or this term called SuperCloud. And the folks who came up with this are good friends over at SiliconAngle Media, or the folks as theCUBE. And so very, very excited to have a longtime friend of the show, my former boss, Dave Vellante. Dave, great to have you on the show. It's excited to, we haven't spoken in a little while face-to-face, so I'm excited to have you on the show.
Yeah, great to talk to you, Brian. Thanks for having me.
I want to dive into sort of this term that you guys have put around this thing we're talking about. But for anybody who doesn't know you, and that's kind of a hard thing for anybody in our industry, you've been the face of theCUBE. You and John have been sort of the dynamic duo, or the ESPN of tech. But give folks a little bit about your background, because not only have you been sort of front and center from a media perspective talking about this, but you've got a pretty rich history of having analyzed the industry for a long time as well. Give folks some background on kind of how you became so well known in the industry, if you will.
Well, thank you, Brian. Well, like you said, most people know me from theCUBE, but I fell in love with tech a long time ago. When I was a teenager, my father was superintendent at my high school in Massachusetts, and he did a deal with An Wang for Wang Computer.
Wow.
A lot of your audience, I'm sure, never heard of that company. but he got a free system, and I taught myself BASIC, and I loved the logic aspect of programming. And when I got to college, I started in computer science, and I took courses in COBOL and Fortran and Pascal, but our mainframe was so crappy. We literally had punch cards. So I switched to math, but I always loved computers. And then in my senior year, I got a hold of an Apple IIe and learned assembler, and it had this 6502 microprocessor, and I wrote a Pac-Man program that was stored on a floppy disk for one of my final projects. But, I really was kind of a sloppy coder, and the economy was really not too great when I graduated. But there was this fast-growing company called IDG, and I landed a job at IDC. And, technology back then was mysterious to everybody. So I just dove in, read a bunch of technical docs and journals and academic papers, and became an analyst. Remember, back then everything was mainframe centric. And so I spent a lot of years at IDC covering a variety of domains and managing different businesses. So I had kind of a front row seat for the transition to PCs and client server and the internet, and got to meet some really great tech icons and watch the industry evolve, because I've been around a long time. I'm a bit of an industry historian, and that served me well on theCUBE, where we, of course, interviewed thousands of technologists and smart people. And the worst, you'll laugh at this, but the worst compliment I ever got was somebody said to me at one of the VM worlds that, Dave, your biggest strength is a little bit about a lot of things. And it's kind of true.
Yeah. Yeah, well, in the cube and in what you do, we were talking about this before. Pre-pandemic, you guys were getting to 70 events in a year. You were covering kind of everything. The thing I've always appreciated about you, not only were you good enough to give me a chance to sort of get into that segment of the industry, but you really dig into not only the technology, and I wouldn't say that you are a super deep technologist anymore, but you really dig into the business side of things, right? You're very much not caught up in the hype. Sometimes analysts kind of it's a buzzword or something. You really dig into it, and so when you guys kind of introduced this concept of SuperCloud, which you started talking about at AWS reInvent at the end of 2021, so not a couple of months ago, it caught my interest, because I thought, Dave doesn't create hype for hype reasons, right? You're never about sort of the clicks. You're really about what's going on in the business, what's driving all this. So give us a sense of where did the term come from? What's the trend that you're seeing that kind of got you saying, hey, this is something worth really diving into some more?
Well, I think you said it up front. I'm glad you saw it, and we've seen it too. Is something's changing and something's different, and we came up with this term SuperCloud to try to describe that change. And thinking about, and I've been challenged. What is this? Is it really a thing? Which is good. It's always good to be challenged. So I really think it's a rethinking, or maybe a rebranding, or an evolution of multi-cloud, which I never really liked.
Yeah.
Multi-cloud from a vendor perspective, and you guys have talked about this on your show. It really was kind of cloud compatibility. It wasn't marketed that way, but that's kind of what it was. A company would, containerize its legacy stack and shove it into a cloud, or they maybe do the work and build cloud native services in one of the big clouds, but there really wasn't much of any, cross cloud leverage or integration. And so, but the interesting thing to me was multi-cloud from a buyer perspective. I always felt was more of a symptom of multi-vendor. I got different workloads, right, running in different clouds, or I bought a company and they run on Azure and I'm running on AWS. But generally, it wasn't a strategy to build value on top of hyperscale infrastructure. It was more about transforming your IT and doing work in the cloud because it's cheaper or simpler or agile or all those things. So, and I think that's beginning to change. That's what we started to observe. And it started really, Jerry Chen wrote this thing, Castles in a Cloud. You probably read it.
Mm-hmm.
They're building this database of all the cloud services and the sub-markets. And they talk about, sub-clouds, that there is this thinking there. But it got me thinking that there's a higher level of abstraction that's coalescing in the market. And that's where the sort of term came out of it. And observing things like what Snowflake was doing. We can talk about that. But there's tight integration of services across clouds, but that underlying complexity is hidden, and is ideally an identical experience across those clouds, and in my dreams, even on-prem for some platforms. So I think what's newish and is evolving are things like, location independence, and, we should probably talk about the edge, and metadata services that can optimize for whether it's locality or governance or privacy. And recovery is another sort of aspect that's part of this integration. So we're seeing that evolve. And I think the two biggest things that are new is the technology's evolving, where you're seeing services that are really integrated across clouds. And the other big change is digital transformation, where there's this new innovation curve that's developing. And it's not just about making your IT better, it's about SaaSifying and automating your entire company's workflow. So it's not just a vendor thing to me, it's the evolution of the term, the phrase, every company will be a SaaS company. Every company is going to deliver capabilities that can be consumed as cloud services.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and I want to kind of come back to that industry piece here in a little bit. When we were thinking about it, I think the way that things kind of, some of the dots connected for us was, when sort of cloud first, came along, when the AWSs of the world first came along, it was very much the disruptor model, right? We're going to start sort of one interesting service or two interesting services. They were going to be cheaper. Maybe they didn't have all the functionality. So if it was storage, it wasn't going to be as much as an EMC or a NetApp box, but it was, it was cheap and capable. Over time, we saw them fill out this portfolio to the point where, they literally are, if you took, almost everything that you can do in IT, like they have that as a capability. But I also feel like what we're seeing is, we see this historically. This is a lot of why you are really super valuable, because you've seen some things, you've seen trends happen. We've never gone long times in IT or anything in technology where differentiation didn't become the thing, right? And I feel like to a certain extent, while the cloud providers have, built out hundreds of services and built out their portfolio, they sort of, I don't want to say stopped innovating, but it was never like, hey, we have to build the best next thing. It was like, we just have to have the thing. So if you're in our world, and that sort of led to this rise of these other capabilities, right? Like a Snowflake being able to compete against a Redshift or something else, or, Confluent being able to build, Kafka, but Kafka better than just sort of the generic version. Is there some amount of that you're seeing as well, where it's like, the market is saying, hey, I don't just want the generic version of stuff that comes in the place where I'm at. I also, I need higher level differentiated services, right? Those are the things that take work off of my plate and allow me to focus on my business and stuff. Do you see any of that in sort of what you talk about with SuperCloud?
I think it's a really interesting topic that you bring up. And I think that is the essence of it. I think that, and I think it depends on which cloud you're talking about, right? I think AWS definitely has prioritized spinning up services and having, granular access to its APIs, and definitely has prioritized that over integration. And that's evolving.
Sure.
But you think of AWS, to your point, they optimize for cost reduction with the shared infrastructure, which is great for a lot of workloads. But as you know, enterprise buyers, they'll spend money to save time because they're labor constrained. But the hyperscalers, they'll spend engineering time to save money. And AWS is a good example of that. But, it's interesting to contrast with Microsoft, because they're kind of trying to have their cake and eat it too, which is a strategy that's serving them pretty well. But they got a broad set of choices, a lot of services. They got and data stores, for example, they got lots of them. But they're willing to do things like Synapse, which brings some integration and simplification. So it's definitely a trend we're seeing, even with Amazon, like Amazon Connect, for example. But to your point, Snowflake is a great example of what I would consider a super cloud, and one of the platforms that got us thinking about the term, because they're optimizing for, simplicity and speed and so forth, but data sharing, irrespective of location. You're logging into their cloud. And it solves a problem that the big three aren't trying to solve. And frankly, they're not qualified to solve. And you're seeing this in a lot of different spaces, certainly, data protection and security, and, name a sector. And you're seeing a company that, generally speaking, is going to add value that the hyperscalers don't. I think Google, they're kind of playing catch up, and they got a lot of data. So does Amazon. But I'll say this, coming back to AWS, I think it's really interesting to see how this plays out. They've got to be careful about the types of vertical services and integrations that they go after. It's got to be big enough for them because of their approach. But I think SuperCloud is an architecture that's going to drive digital business transformation, not just IT transformation. And that, to me, means, to your point, there's that added value that the hyperscalers really aren't going to deliver.
Right. Well, and I think the other thing that happens, and you and I have lived in, both the sort of the ugly part of the IT world, which is like, it's not sexy, but it gets the job done, type of stuff. We're, more than a decade into sort of public cloud, and we're now sort of reaching a point where, it's having to sort of do the mundane, common stuff that people are like, yeah, I just want that thing to work. I don't really care about all the headlines. I just need those things. And I think, that's the other part of this is those cloud businesses are now, very, very large run rates, right? And so they're going to go through the natural kind of, challenge of, do we keep optimizing for the thing that's making us money, like a Cisco has gone through in the past, or an Oracle, or a big, and then having these sort of new companies come along who are like, I'm native to a cloud architecture, but I'm going to differentiate. I think they're in an interesting stage, and it's also really interesting, especially like in AWS's case. They've got a new leader in charge, and if you think about, and you guys did a great interview with him pre reInvent, he's got on his mind, I've got to get higher up in the stack, but I got to imagine, they're also sitting there going, boy, look at the margins I'm making just on these infrastructure services. Should I be doubling down on those sort of things? I think those things are the foundation of what's also leading to this rise in these new types of services, because they're, these companies, a Snowflake, a MongoDB, whoever, are able to focus all their attention on that and come up with the new innovation. I think that's an interesting, again, timing is always as much a part of this as technology. Yeah,
and I think this was really evident at reInvent. And one of the other, one of the other things that spawned my thinking around SuperCloud was the defensive posture that you would hear from a lot of the traditional infrastructure companies like a Dell or an HPE. Not all the workloads are going to the public cloud, blah, 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 blah. But my thought on this is there's hundreds of billions of CapEx spent every year by the big four, if you include Alibaba, on cloud infrastructure that you can build on top of. And I think this was really evident at reInvent this year. I know you guys didn't make it, but the ecosystem was really vibrant, and there was way less talk about AWS as a competitor versus the innovation that companies are building on top of this CapEx infrastructure. Yeah. So the ecosystem is really becoming much more sophisticated, and I think realizing that they don't move faster than AWS, they're going to get crushed. I mean, you look what happened to Cloudera. The cloud kind of really disintermediated that whole big data space and the Hadoop space. But the flip side is they're realizing, as is AWS, that the depth of services, to the point you made earlier, that the ecosystem can provide in a specific area is greater than what the cloud vendors are delivering, whether it's backup or file services. You have this talk about data mesh and data services. You see networking, companies like Aviatrix doing some things, really interesting things across cloud, and security. You see what the prominent security vendors are doing. And, even in applications, I mean, admittedly, SaaS and PaaS are where SuperCloud starts to morph and get a little bit fuzzy. But I'll say this. The idea that a SaaS company, that you're going to build out your own data centers like a Salesforce or a ServiceNow is, I think, going to be increasingly rare, notwithstanding, and, maybe we could talk about that, the Sarah Wang and Martin Casado post on cloud cogs and the Amazon bill killing your margins, like the Dropbox example. And of course, there'll be more direct connects and Equinix data centers and the like. But increasingly, I think we're seeing consumption and cloud pricing models emerging in SaaS, and I think customers are going to demand it. And so fewer companies are going to be kind of running their own data centers. And there's an opportunity to do that difficult R&D work and leverage the primitives and APIs of the hyperscalers, but then hide that complexity and deliver value on top of that. And I think, by the way, I don't think the hyperscalers are in a good position to do that. I wouldn't trust AWS with my multi-cloud strategy. Would you?
Yeah, no, I think they've all three of them have sort of announced these multi-cloud strategies, but then when you look at them and you go, okay, there's the sort of the center of their strategy, the center of their architecture, and everything else sort of seems like a stepchild to a certain extent, right? It sort of gets secondary, tertiary treatment. And you think about that and you're like, boy, that's not all that different than the way, kind of quote unquote traditional software vendors or whatever kind of had to treat their business for a while, right? Like, on-premise sort of the core of what we do, and the cloud is this sort of secondary thing. I do think it's interesting. I think we've now had a decade of learning how to work in the cloud, learning how, working in an AWS environment is different than working in a VMware environment or, GCP. And I think it's interesting that, like you said, we've sort of seen this explosion of companies who probably would have treated an AWS or the public cloud as purely competitive before, software companies, Red Hat, an IBM, VMware, whoever. And they now very much are doing these sort of unique integrations, unique partnerships. And you've mentioned this before, like the thing that they bring isn't so much, super, super unique, differentiated technology, but it's this trust they have with the customer that's been built up over decades. And they have a really deep understanding that no two customers look exactly the same, and all these weird sort of corner niche use cases that enterprises demand, like they want those in the cloud too. They don't sort of want to go, oh, just give me the vanilla version of IT when I get to the cloud. Like they want that. And I think that, that combined with sort of 10 years of now knowing how to do this, how to do DevOps, how to do SRE, we're going to see this explosion begin to happen. Because, if COVID has done nothing else and you've been impacted, your business has been impacted, my business has been impacted, like the new habits that we have are very, very public cloud centric. It's just, that ease of use is really kind of driven what we do now.
You guys made I don't know, what might have been your year-end kind of wrap-up. And you said, we used to talk about VMware all the time. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I can't think of anything that was really substantive. So to your point, everybody's building in the cloud.
Yeah.
And they're realizing, hey, there's a lot more to be done here. There's huge gaps and white space. I mean, I got to say that you got to give Amazon a lot of credit for how they've changed our entire industry's thinking, working backwards from the customer, 2 pizza teams, all that, the bromide. But you hear that from everybody now. And so, yeah. So I think, again, SuperCloud was this notion that there are so many gaps and so much opportunity to build value on top, whether it's horizontally. You largely see Snowflake, for example, doing that. You mentioned Mongo, or vertically with the Goldman Sachs announcement at re:Invent, where they're bringing their data and their tools and their software and their clients, and they're connecting their on-prem to the AWS world and building their own cloud. And that, I think, is a real trend. It is a thing.
Yeah, and I think you highlighted this in the write-up you had for SuperCloud. I wanted to come back to it. You mentioned earlier, this isn't just IT services, right? This is we're seeing these sort of vertical industries, if you will. At re:Invent, it was Goldman Sachs, and it was one of the telco companies. I forget which one, like a Comcast. Yeah. I think 3M was in there. There's a. But I think what becomes interesting about that is, and again, I sort of have this thing I call Gracely's theorem, which is kind of a joke, but it's not completely. Is a decade ago we used to have this idea of like community clouds or industry clouds, and it sounded sort of interesting at the time, like, oh, there's going to be an automotive cloud and the various companies will work together. But back then we didn't really have very well defined API standards. It was like, well, who's going to run the environment? I think, like this Goldman Sachs thing or any of the others are going to begin to be the kind of the beginning of not only just them offering what they do as SaaS services, but realizing that their service becomes more powerful when it gets combined with something else. Maybe it's a SoFi that helps them, reach out to a new set of customers, or it's an integration with the car companies to be able to do, per day leasing, or, I think that's the other side of this that people aren't completely grasping is once some of these really, vertical oriented things get in the cloud, but then they have access to APIs that they didn't necessarily think about individually before, we're going to see some really interesting kind of services evolve that might be industry specific, community specific, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I think, I remember right after the first re:Invent, I wasn't there, but I watched. And I remember thinking, wow, if your expertise is provisioning LUNs, you better rethink what you're doing. And then a broader thinking, okay, the vendor community and the technology community are going to change dramatically. And so how do you compete, if you will, with this new beast, this new gorilla? And my thinking at the time was, if you can organize your business around data and integrate that within your own ecosystem, put data at the core of your business. I didn't use the term digital business at the time, but innovation will spawn from that, and integration is going to enable adoption. And the Goldman Sachs service is I think a really good example of that. And there are, so the public cloud and the SuperCloud are sort of an accelerant to that.
Yeah.
What's interesting, Brian, I think edge is a real wild card here, because you got data moving to the edge, you got low cost sensors, you got things like real time inference, and the flow of data is being integrated into the product itself.
Right.
And that's fundamental to reduce costs. You got to catch problems, and data enables that. You think Tesla. So data is going to be processed close to where it's being created, whether it's in the automobile industry, the healthcare, manufacturing, et cetera. And you're integrating analytics with transactions. And so the big question is, how are the hyperscalers going to play here? What role does cloud and SuperCloud play there? And you've got these dual disruption agendas that Amazon and Google have, where they're horizontal in technology and vertical, retail, grocery, media, healthcare, autos, Waymo. And that's going to create some tension. And it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. I don't know if you have any sort of thoughts on the edge as a potential disruptor for cloud.
Yeah. This is an area where on one hand, you sort of go, well, fundamentally, it should, potentially open up some new opportunities, because while the sort of big three have been concentrating what they do in their data centers in sort of, these massive computing farms, if you will, the edge all of a sudden becomes, how do I get access to last mile bandwidth, and it's small form factor, and you don't necessarily get economies of scale. There's one side of me that sort of goes, okay, that's going to be an opportunity for disruptors, for the next, company that can kind of spin out of nowhere and become AWS. And then the flip side of it is I look at it and I go, but you have things like, and I forget what the name of it is. It's sort of the edge thing that Amazon's doing, where it's going, I want to put, sort of small Amazons in big cities and be able to, service the entertainment industry, because I'll put a pop in Los Angeles or near Hollywood, or I'll put, 5 or 6 of them around New York and New Jersey and be able to help, financial services. And so I feel like the edge is still this sort of wild, wild west, because we don't have a defined architecture, because there's so many different use cases. But I feel like it is sort of wide open. It doesn't feel like it's sort of, hey, the game's been decided like cloud's been for the last 5 or 6 years. It feels like it's still really open, because there is no one edge architecture, whereas there is sort of one cloud architecture. I mean, that's kind of where my head is still trying to process stuff.
Yeah, I think you talk about like local zones, right? Isn't it?
Yeah, local zones.
I think it's going to bifurcate. I think that local zones, what's interesting? AWS says in the fullness of time, all workloads are going to run in the public cloud. And that's only true if the cloud expands to the edge,
right? And
cloud players can kind of adjust their dogma. And you think about local zone, that to me is like the near edge. I think it's going to bifurcate. I think the far edge is, again, I bring up Tesla. Tesla as an insurance company is a really interesting thought exercise, and how they're using ARM-based processors and new architectures, and kind of disconnect. I mean, there's a cloud connection there, but most of their data, isn't persisted. It stays, locally. So that I think traditional businesses are going to leverage SuperCloud and transition to their cloud model. And I think there's a new disruption scenario down the road at the far edge.
Yeah, and and I think the one great thing for anybody who's sort of innovating in this space is, if you were trying to innovate as a managed service provider 5, 6, 7 years ago, like, you had no chance, because you weren't sort of backed. I mean, all the big three clouds also have these huge cash cows for other parts of their business that allows them to get funded. I feel like whether it's the edge or even some of the SuperCloud stuff, like, you're coming at it at a time now when they're having to make these challenging decisions, right? Like we talked about it before, like, do I double down on the things that are making me cash right now, or do I try and disrupt my ecosystem, which is, driving my cash flow, and try and, move up the stack and disrupt them? And, this is a prime opportunity for folks to be like, if I'm going to bet that they're not going to maybe eat their ecosystem, this is a great chance for me to kind of, jump in and do that stuff. So yeah, I feel like it's, sometimes the cloud feels a little stagnant. We're like, oh, it's the big three and it's 5 new announcements a day. But I feel like, this thing, whether it's ends up becoming called SuperCloud or something else, I feel like there is, we're at the beginning of what the next generation of this is, whether it happens at the edge or in these SuperCloud things.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, you got 4 hyperscalers. It's the big 3 US and Alibaba, and that's it.
Right.
And I think SuperCloud, whether the term sticks or not, who knows? But I think it's all about the ecosystem. And the ecosystem is what differentiates those hyperscalers from everybody else. And those ecosystems are going to evolve around industries like we just talked about. And I think AWS, I think they're predominantly going to sell infrastructure and middleware and AI and databases. And they'll take a piece of that SuperCloud action by selling cloud services. And Microsoft, they got a different story. I mean, they just made this massive bet on Activision, and they're going into the metaverse. You guys just talked about this, I think, last week. And then, Google, they focus on data. They'll play catch up. But I think it could get interesting is Google uses its cloud and its ecosystem to disrupt Amazon's core retail business. Like, you think about Alibaba. Alibaba doesn't have, the big warehouse model. Mm-hmm. Amazon has. Well, what if Google disrupts that by developing, an ecosystem of sellers and I don't know, uses blockchain to enable direct connects from buyer to seller and bypass Amazon? So I think Amazon has a lot of disruption scenarios that Jassy has to deal with. What if the Chinese government, for example, says, well, listen, these goods that are manufactured in China, they can't be sold on Amazon. They can only be sold on Alibaba. Well, that doesn't necessarily affect US as much, but across Asia, people are going to buy from Alibaba. So the whole geopolitical thing, public policy, I think Microsoft is in a much better position than Google and Amazon with regard to, pressure from the government. So,
right.
A lot of different vectors that we have to sort of think about going forward.
Yeah, no, I think, you laid out stuff right there that could be 5, 6, 7 episodes of the podcast. I think, the thing I like about this SuperCloud discussion, and, you mentioned at the beginning, there's folks that are giving you grief about, oh, this is just a made up term. And, who is this really for real? I think the thing that I like the most about it is it's us saying, look, if you really evaluate where we are sort of historically in this and the other factors that are, and the other factors that are involved with this, whether they're geopolitical or they become location or they become, government antitrust, like we're beginning to now get into a time when it feels like some of the rules that we've kind of come to live by 10 years may start breaking apart. They may start, changing and so forth. And, it's a time for folks, I think, to step back and go, what are these other forces that might impact some stuff, and kind of, wrap your head around with those things. To me, that's the most interesting part of this discussion, not so much just like, is this a term that we should all adopt? Words and terms. If anybody's worked in technology, naming is always a hard thing. But I like that you guys are willing to sort of put yourself out there and go, hey, look, we've been living in this space for a long time, and there's something changing, and trying to put your head around it and quantify it and put it in a diagram that I think is really important to do.
Yeah, I've never liked multi-cloud, but I do with SuperCloud. It is kind of a rallying call for technology companies who don't own their own cloud, or maybe they're late to cloud. But it's also, I think, a North Star for organizations that are trying to transform their kind of physical business. And there's a real opportunity for them to capitalize on this huge CapEx gift that's been laid out by the hyperscalers. And, it's not just about SaaS. It's not just about cloud. It's about automation, which is a huge, huge opportunity to take out cost. And because we have a lot of problems in the world, and, we're not going to solve them with human labor.
Right. Right. Dave, it is always great to spend some time with you, to catch up with you. Real quick, obviously, we're not going to as many events right now. Hopefully, we've been saying for 2 years, hopefully those things change. what are all the ways you guys haven't stopped, kind of covering this industry in all sorts of ways? Tell me about how is the Cube adapting? What are some of the things that you guys are focused on these days? Kind of give me the 2-minute dump on how folks can keep getting good information out of the Cube and Silicon Alley or SiliconAngle, excuse me.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, SiliconAngle.com is our news site, and that hasn't missed a beat. We flow a lot of content there, as you know, and including the Cube. The Cube has 2 studios, one outside of Boston and one in Palo Alto, and they've been really, really busy. We flow everything to thecube.net, which has been great. We're running a lot of hybrid events and digital events. Whenever there's a physical event, we'll have a virtual or hybrid overlay to that. And then I write weekly, pretty much every week. Kind of trying to, you guys inspire me on your cadence. But I have a series called Breaking Analysis that I publish on SiliconAngle.com and Wikibon.com, and we turn it into a podcast and obviously videos, and we make clips and put it out on social. So, our style is confetti across the web, and that hasn't changed. We virtualized the Cube essentially in the last 2 years.
Yeah, no, and it is, I've always said, you and the team over there do an awesome job of, not only diving in when you need to get really into the weeds, but also, having enough breadth to be able to go, we're a place you can come to sort of learn about everything, and you guys do a great job connecting the dots. So, like I said, I've always been thankful that you guys gave me a chance to be part of the community and be involved with it. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Dave, thank you so much for the time. I suspect this is a topic that we'll be coming back to from time to time as it evolves and people have opinions, and we see kind of how it materializes. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. Again, thanks so much to Dave for his time today. As always, folks, thanks for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for giving us feedback. I know we did a show on Web3. I've gotten probably as much feedback as we've gotten on a lot of shows lately from that one. So we like taking on all sorts of topics. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.